A rural stretch of road. Empty, except for the occasional crow and the trees that line each side like silent witnesses. Fog clings to the ground like a veil, muting everything it touches. You wouldn't think danger could hide here, but it did. A patrol car crawls along the asphalt, headlights dimmed by the mist. The officer inside has done this 100 times. A stalled car, a stranded motorist, just another moment of public service, another day in uniform. He slows down, puts the car in park. Radio crackles, door opens, boots hit the pavement. The officer steps out, and within moments, his body hits the same ground. The shooter disappears into the fog. Quiet, fast, deliberate. No warning, no second chances. When backup arrives, they find only the worst kind of silence. A badge, blood, and the question, why? Because this wasn't just a senseless act. It was calculated, unflinching, and it wasn't the first sign of trouble. This motorist wasn't lost. He wasn't confused. He had a history, long, winding, often ignored. The kind of history that should have raised alarms long before the morning turned fatal. And the officer? He wasn't just a man in a uniform. He was someone's father, someone's friend, a mentor, a protector, the kind who said yes when others said someone else would do it. This is the story of how help turned deadly, how a stranger in need became an executioner, and how a routine stop unraveled into a national reckoning about justice, compassion, and the consequences of looking away for too long. Because sometimes, the people we stop to help aren't looking for rescue. They're waiting for a target. Selfless, the officer who stopped and never came home. He wasn't chasing headlines. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was simply doing what he'd always done, showing up. Officer Justin Hare wore the uniform without ego, without bravado. His duty wasn't just a job, it was a commitment sealed by choice, by discipline, and by a quiet belief that someone had to stand between chaos and the rest of us. In a world spinning faster and growing colder, he chose to step forward. By all accounts, Hare had always been that person. Reliable, grounded, the type to stay late without being asked. The one who showed up early even when no one noticed. In a profession built on structure and routine, Hare understood that true safety often lies in the unseen, what never happens because someone made sure it didn't. He wasn't perfect, but he was steady. In New Mexico, where remote highways stretch for miles and cell signals vanish with the horizon, Officer Hare was one of the few who answered calls that came with silence on the other end. Stranded travelers, domestic disputes tucked behind dirt roads, runaways, missing persons, flares in the dark. It takes a certain kind of mind to walk into the unknown with nothing but a badge and belief that you're doing the right thing. Hare had done it many times before. Most of those moments never made the news. No viral footage. No ticker tape. Just quiet resolve. But this time, everything would be different. On that early morning in March, when he slowed his patrol car near a vehicle on the shoulder, there was no siren. No backup. Just a man trained to help, following instinct. There was no way for Hare to know that this wasn't a mechanical problem. No way to sense what was waiting beyond that driver's side door. And yet, he got out anyway. He didn't hesitate. He approached, unarmed, unworried, thinking perhaps this would be another ordinary stop. A dead battery, a scared driver, a hand on the shoulder and reassurance that help had arrived. Instead, he was met with violence so fast, so deliberate, it left no time for defense. What happened next didn't just take a life. It took a community's sense of security. It shook the foundation of what it means to serve. And it forced a painful question into the light. When help costs a man everything, who do we become if we simply move on? It was just after dawn. The kind of quiet that only exists before the world fully wakes up. Highway 66 stretched ahead, empty and muted. The road blending into morning fog like a ribbon pulled tight across the horizon. The patrol car moved steadily through it. Routine sweep, no sirens, no urgency. Nothing seemed wrong, until something did. A vehicle appeared along the shoulder. A white sedan. The hazards weren't blinking. The hood wasn't popped, but it looked out of place. The kind of out of place that makes trained instincts pause. Officer Justin Hare slowed down. The stop wasn't logged as high risk. No threats, no red flags, just a lone car, a lone driver, and a lone officer on a road where cell signals disappear before you know you've lost them. No one knows exactly what was said when Officer Hare stepped out of his car. No camera caught the moment he approached the driver's side. But somewhere between his greeting and the silence that followed, everything changed. What we do know is this: gunshots were heard. Not many, just enough to mark the end of something. Just enough to signal something irreversible had happened. Somewhere along that road, a resident heard what they thought were fireworks. Another heard yelling, then nothing. Emergency dispatch logged the call just before 6:30 a.m. A frantic voice reported an officer down. A rush of radio chatter followed: codes, coordinates, the kinds of numbers and phrases that never make it to the public, but haunt those who hear them in real time. Shots fired. Officer down. No response. When backup arrived minutes later, they found the patrol car parked at an angle. Driver's side door still open. The officer's body was nearby. His weapon hadn't been drawn. Whoever did this was already gone. He left the engine running. He left the man who tried to help him bleeding into the dust. And he left behind a trail that would soon stretch across state lines. Every mile a question with no immediate answer. What would drive someone to do this? Why that officer? And was it planned, or just opportunity twisted by something deeper? This day had started like hundreds before it. A patrol, a stop, a duty to serve. But this time, the road didn't just carry a car. It carried a trap. And the price of stepping out of that cruiser was a life. The road was quiet. And so was the man who walked it. Jeremy Smith wasn't a stranger to trouble. His past was a patchwork of chaos and violence, a life marked by impulsive decisions, addiction, and anger that had never been properly addressed. And now, on this day, on this stretch of road, that same anger would shape the final chapter of another man's story. Smith wasn't new to criminal behavior. His history was a lengthy one, filled with arrests and charges that hinted at a deeper turmoil. Domestic violence, theft, drug abuse. There were moments when those around him should have known, when a red flag should have waved. But in the background, behind the mask of an often quiet individual, Jeremy Smith remained a ghost, moving through life with a mix of volatility and calm. He wasn't a person anyone noticed until it was too late. But on this morning, as he sat behind the wheel of a broken-down vehicle on a lonely road, the reality of his choices had come to a head. Why was he there? What brought him to that spot at that time with that officer approaching? Was it a plan he'd spent days contemplating, or was it a flash of madness in the moment? There were no easy answers. But it's clear that something about this moment, this encounter, was premeditated. Smith wasn't waiting to be helped. He wasn't seeking assistance. He was waiting to act. For years, Jeremy had been a master of manipulation, using people and situations to his advantage when he needed. He knew how to talk his way out of trouble, how to play the part of the victim when necessary. But on this day, there was no room for words. It wasn't a random act of desperation. This was deliberate. There's a chilling complexity in the way some individuals approach violence. It doesn't always come from an immediate rage. Sometimes it comes from cold calculation, from someone who knows how to disguise their true intentions to weave a story that fits the moment. The officer was there to help, but in a world where trust can be manipulated so easily, Smith knew how to take advantage of that trust. It was more than just a chance meeting on the road. It was a trap, and the officer, unaware, was walking straight into it. Jeremy Smith had, at this point in his life, made the conscious decision to act on what had been simmering beneath the surface. A man who once had the chance to change now chose a path of violence. There were no more excuses. No more second chances. The events that followed weren't mistakes. They were actions. Cold, violent, and calculated. As the officer got out of his car and approached the scene, Jeremy Smith's past of manipulation and violence came to fruition. What was meant to be a simple traffic stop became a deadly confrontation, one in which an officer would lose his life and Jeremy would begin his own journey down a path that would forever change his fate. But who was the real victim here? The officer, whose sole mission was to help, was dead. And Jeremy Smith, who had taken that life, would now have to face the truth of what he had done. But questions remain. Was this really the moment when Smith's past caught up with him? Or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface of a life already marked by too many mistakes to count? The calm that followed was anything but peaceful. Within minutes, the world of Officer Justin Hare's colleagues, his friends, and his family had been irrevocably altered. News of the shooting spread through the department, a ripple of shock coursing through the air as officers scrambled to process what had just unfolded. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not today. Not to him. Officer Hare had been everything they had come to expect from a dedicated cop, honest, reliable, committed. He had spent years building a reputation grounded in service and care, and now that legacy was shattered in the span of moments. His colleagues, who once laughed with him during break room chats, now found themselves confronting the unbearable truth. One of their own had been struck down in the line of duty, leaving only the harsh quiet of a vacant patrol car. A manhunt began almost immediately. The scene was chaotic, but the officers' professionalism didn't waver. A network of law enforcement, state police, local authorities, and federal agents mobilized in an attempt to track down the killer. Streets were cordoned off. A search grid was drawn out across the area. Every lead was followed, every possible witness questioned. Yet, amid the frenzy of activity, the stillness of the hunt was unnerving. Jeremy Smith had already vanished. It was a bizarre blend of order and disarray. A methodical search paired with the inexplicable silence that always follows when something as brutal as this occurs. Smith, however, wasn't just another fugitive. His every move was being monitored, his face broadcast on every television screen. Every passing moment felt like a race to find him before his actions could stain the community any deeper. The question on everyone's mind, how long would it take to find him? And then, after hours of searching, a break came. One of Smith's acquaintances, someone who had known him from his troubled past, made an anonymous tip. They said they knew where he was hiding. A shadowed alleyway near an old, abandoned building became the focal point of the search. When officers arrived, they moved quickly, surrounding the area, not knowing if Smith would still be there, waiting or gone. It took only seconds after the first flash of the searchlight. Smith was spotted, his figure darting into the shadows, but the law enforcement response was swift and decisive. He was cornered. His options were few. The choice was made for him. Within moments, Smith was taken into custody. The quiet that followed was almost unbearable. They had him, but the horror he had unleashed could not be undone. As Smith was led away in handcuffs, his face betraying no emotion, the weight of his actions began to settle on the shoulders of those left behind. What could be said? What could be done? There were no words to make sense of the devastation. Back at the station, as officers debriefed and tried to make sense of the day's events, the phone calls began. One by one, Officer Hare's loved ones were informed. And then the phone rang for his wife. Her name was whispered softly over the line. What followed was a slow, deliberate descent into heartbreak. No one can prepare for the sudden loss of a loved one, especially under such brutal circumstances. His wife's voice wavered, holding back tears that no one would hear. She had been left with nothing but the unbearable silence of his absence. Her reaction was raw, one of disbelief, one of utter devastation. As the reality of what had happened began to sink in, there was no way to undo the damage done to her family. A sense of loss settled over the household like a fog, thick and heavy. The children, young and innocent, could not yet comprehend the enormity of their father's death. They knew he was gone, but how could they understand the magnitude of the void he left? The world outside continued to move, unrelenting, indifferent, but in that home, time seemed to stop. The absence of Officer Justin Hare's steady presence echoed in every corner, in every shadow. And as for the rest of the community, they too were left with questions. How could something like this happen in their town? What was behind the violence that had taken a man who had dedicated his life to protecting them? Answers didn't come quickly. But as the investigation would soon reveal, the truth was far from simple. The courtroom was packed. Every chair was filled. The air was thick with expectation and, for some, dread. The trial of Jeremy Smith had finally begun. After the chaotic events that led to Officer Justin Hare's death, everyone wanted answers. But what would the trial reveal? What would the defense say? What truth would finally emerge? For the victim's family, this moment had been a long time coming. The world had been shaken by the brutal loss, but now in the sterile, controlled environment, the world of justice would unfold. The clock had started ticking, and the answers to the questions that had haunted them since the day of the shooting were now within reach. The opening statements were a measured recount of the events, pieced together in ways the public hadn't yet heard. But each word was a reminder of the devastation that Officer Hare's family had endured. The timeline was laid out methodically: how the call had come in, how Officer Hare had responded, how the tragic encounter had occurred. Each detail painted a picture of a man who had only been doing his job, stepping into the unknown, not realizing it would be his final act of service. The courtroom went silent as the prosecution delivered the cold facts. Smith had fired that fatal shot. He had been the one to pull the trigger, ending a life that had meant so much to so many. But it wasn't as simple as that. Nothing ever is. The defense was preparing their case. And it wasn't just a case of simple facts, it was a case about what could be construed as motive. Their strategy hinged on something that would prove controversial: mental illness. The defense lawyer was careful with his words, his tone measured, almost pleading. They presented Jeremy Smith not as a cold-blooded killer, but as someone who had been tormented, someone who was unstable, someone whose actions could be linked to a fragile state of mind. Could it have been an accident? Could the events that unfolded have been the result of a mind teetering on the edge of collapse? The courtroom was divided. The prosecution's stance was clear: no amount of mental illness could justify the cold-blooded nature of the act. The defense, however, would argue that Smith had not been entirely in control of his actions, that he was a victim of his own mind, driven to that moment of violence by forces beyond his control. The juxtaposition was stark. One side portrayed the crime as intentional, calculated, and deliberate. The other suggested that it might have been the result of something uncontrollable, something invisible. As the trial progressed, the prosecution presented more evidence, painting a picture of Smith as a man with a history of violence, his actions that day not merely a tragic outburst, but part of a larger pattern. His past was laid bare for all to see: violent offenses, altercations, troubling behavior. How could someone with such a history suddenly claim innocence due to mental illness? Was it just a convenient defense, a plea to avoid the full weight of justice? In the victim's family, a simmering mix of grief and anger was impossible to ignore. They were in that room, living the nightmare again. The memories of the man they loved had been twisted and discussed in every possible way. The pain was evident, but so was their resolve. They would not let the defense's claims of mental illness diminish their loved one's life. The statements from Officer Hare's family were among the most heart-wrenching moments of the trial. His widow took the stand, her voice breaking as she recalled the man she had lost. She spoke of the man who had been a father to their children, a husband who had shared his hopes and dreams, a man who had given his life to protect others. Her words carried the weight of her heartache, each sentence a reminder of what had been taken from her. She wasn't the only one who spoke. Officer Hare's colleagues, those who had worked alongside him, recounted their memories of him. Not just as an officer, but as a friend. The loss they felt was as profound as it was personal. They didn't just miss the man in uniform, they missed the person they knew, the one who had shown up every day, ready to do what was right. As the trial unfolded, all eyes were on Jeremy Smith. His demeanor in court was carefully observed, dissected. He sat in the defendant's chair, his hands clasped in front of him, his gaze rarely straying from the table. The defense argued that Smith was haunted by the consequences of his actions, that the weight of what he had done was too much for him to bear. But his lack of outward emotion puzzled many in the room. Was he remorseful? Or was this just a man trying to distance himself from the nightmare he had created? Was he simply playing a role, keeping his true thoughts hidden, or was he truly detached from the gravity of his crime? No one could tell for sure. The prosecution held its ground, maintaining that Smith had made a conscious decision to take Officer Hare's life, a decision that could not be explained away by mental instability. The defense, though, continued to press their argument, trying to show that Smith was not entirely culpable, that his mental state had clouded his judgment in a way that made his actions a product of illness, not malice. The trial would go on. More witnesses, more statements, more revelations. The pressure mounted as the days passed, and the jury, a group of ordinary citizens, would have to decide, was this a case of cold, calculated murder, or something far more complicated? An act committed by a man whose mind could not fully grasp the consequences of his actions? And as the trial dragged on, the courtroom became a battleground. The weight of loss, the desire for justice, and the uncertainty of the truth all collided in a single, heavy moment. What was truly going on behind Smith's gaze? What were his thoughts, his true feelings, if he had any left at all? And would anyone ever truly know? The outcome of this trial would not only determine Smith's fate, but it would offer a chilling reflection on the nature of violence, mental illness, and responsibility. Would the truth emerge from behind the veil of a troubled mind, or would it remain buried, forever obscured? The courtroom was quieter than it had ever been. After weeks of testimony, emotional outbursts, and careful arguments from both sides, it had finally come down to this moment, the sentencing. All eyes were on Jeremy Smith. As he sat in the defendant's chair, the weight of his future rested in the balance. No longer just a person accused of a crime, he was now a man waiting to hear what would happen next as the judge prepared to hand down the final verdict. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a silence that spoke volumes. The case had stirred deep emotions across the country, and now the legal system would deliver its answer. The question wasn't just about Smith's future, it was about the kind of justice that would be served. It was about whether the law could truly reckon with the life lost, Officer Justin Hare's life, and whether his family, his colleagues, and his community would ever find the peace they so desperately sought. The judge, seated high above everyone in the imposing, cold courtroom, opened the proceedings with words that carried a deep gravity. The air was heavy with anticipation. For weeks, the courtroom had been the stage for fierce arguments, but now the stage was set for finality. The judge took his time as he read the details of the case again, his voice unwavering as he went through the events leading up to the tragic death of Officer Hare. It wasn't just a review of the facts, it was a moment to underscore the profound loss, to remind everyone in that room of the life that had been stolen. Then came the verdict. Convicted of the murder of Officer Justin Hare, the judge declared. The words echoed in the room, filling the space with a sense of finality. Jeremy Smith, who had been calm, even detached, throughout most of the trial, now sat motionless. His expression betrayed nothing. It was as if the weight of the verdict had not yet reached him, or perhaps it never would. The judgment was clear, but it was not the end. The sentencing had yet to come. The room seemed to hold its breath. The judge spoke again, this time about the sentence Smith would face. The law required nothing less than life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Life. There would be no turning back. No more chances. No more hope for redemption through parole. The law had made its decision, one that would forever alter the trajectory of Jeremy Smith's life, and for many it seemed like the only fitting consequence for the brutal crime he had committed. But the sentencing wasn't just about Jeremy Smith. It was also about the reaction of those left behind. The families. The public. The people whose lives had been forever changed by this tragedy. Outside the courtroom, the media had been waiting for the moment when the sentence would be handed down. The verdict was big news. The nation had been captivated by the case, and now the sentencing would dominate headlines. For some, the verdict was a long-awaited resolution, a moment where justice was served, however imperfectly. For others, it was a reminder that no sentence could truly undo the damage done. The public reaction was mixed. Some celebrated the sentence, seeing it as a form of closure, the justice that had been long sought. But there were others, including some who followed the case closely, who felt unsettled by the finality of it all. Could a life sentence ever bring back the man who had been killed? Could it erase the pain felt by Officer Hare's family, his children, who would grow up without their father? The media covered every angle, broadcasting statements from those who had followed the case, interviewing legal experts and pundits. Many spoke of the emotional toll this case had taken, of how the trauma of Officer Hare's death had been felt across the nation, not just in his family but in his fellow officers and in the community that had lost a beloved public servant. Then came the most emotional moments of the day, the statements from the family. Officer Hare's wife, who had taken the stand during the trial, had to face her husband's killer one final time. Her words, filled with grief and quiet strength, spoke of the life they had shared, of the plans that would never come to pass. She did not hold back. She expressed the pain, the anger, the disbelief, and yes, the hurt. She said, "No sentence will bring him back. But I hope you, Jeremy Smith, know the devastation you've caused. You have taken my husband and nothing will ever replace him." Her words resonated. It wasn't about vengeance, but it was about justice and a small sense of closure. For her, it was a chance to speak her truth, something that had been denied to her for too long. The children, too young to fully grasp the weight of the situation, stood with their mother. They, like many others, had to learn to live with a world where their father's absence would be their daily reality. The community would rally around them, but the pain would remain. As for Jeremy Smith, his reaction was hard to read. He didn't cry, didn't seem to flinch at the words spoken about him or the sentence handed down. His head remained lowered as the family's statements were read, as if he was already elsewhere, lost in thoughts only he could comprehend. Some say his lack of emotion was his final, most chilling response. An unwillingness to confront the impact of his actions, even as the law did. Others wondered if he was simply numb to everything that had happened to him. But there was no denying the finality of the moment. For Officer Hare's family, the sentence offered something. Maybe not peace, but a semblance of order. A sense that justice had been served, even if it couldn't fix the broken pieces of their lives. Life would go on, but it would never be the same. And as the judge called for the court to adjourn, the only sound that remained in the room was the steady, final gavel. If the story moved you, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps spread the message that justice must be served, and the voices of victims and their families must be heard. Share this video to stand against domestic violence, because silence helps no one, and awareness can save a life. Let's make sure these stories aren't forgotten. Together, we can make a difference.